Thank you, Steven Spielberg, for setting up all the technology again. And we've been working on upgrading our lighting. And Carlene and I are here again today to share with you some more aspects of social work with victims of abuse. We're feeling kind of satisfied that last week we got 9 videos done. We covered so far some of the words that we've touched on: shame, resilience has been in there, hinted at. Using art therapy, we've talked about how abuse has patterns, how maybe abuse with the elderly or abuse with any age, with children, organizational abuse, all these dynamics, there's patterns, but we are never experts on an individual person's life. We always have to be asking, what does that mean to you? How does that work out in your life? How do you feel about that? The client is going to teach us if we ask the right kinds of questions.
And consider it at different levels?
The micro, the meso, the macro. Exactly. So I'm glad you started us off with that. Today's theme is organizations in social work with victims of abuse. So we touched earlier on funding. Funding, money for the work that we do, only ever comes from federal, provincial, municipal government. So the 3 levels of government. It can come from charities, it can come from fee-for-service. And that's about it, except for employee assistance plans. So those are the, if it doesn't come from there, it doesn't come from anywhere. It goes somewhere under those categories. And where your funding comes from has consequences. So let's say if you're funded by the provincial government, and the provincial government, let's say, cuts 37 women's resource centers in your province, it's kind of hard to write to them and say, hey, why don't you give me $1 million so I can do research about how much I hate you and I hate your budget cutbacks, right? Improbable. So this is the situation we often get in, is as we become more and more excellent, refined, nuanced, and substantive about identifying problems in the world and responding to those problems in the world, sometimes the very people who we're engaged with or who are funding us are part of the problem. So, for example, in the whole Black Lives Matter thing, we've seen stories of police officers who are being abusive to citizens, which is kind of the opposite of what they should ever be doing. They're there to protect us, not to harm us, right? So there's a very concrete, right now, immediate, big, global example of how the way we are funded has consequence for what we can deliver. Okay, so hold that thought. Most social workers who work with victims of abuse issues, much of the time we are overworked, underpaid. We are sometimes precariously located, like part-time work, or as grants come in and go out, we get more hours, less hours. So we have to reflect on that. Most of the, let's say, rape crisis centers or women's shelters or homeless shelters or advocacy groups, most of those may get some money from the provincial government, maybe a few bucks here and there from the federal government, and a little bit from charities. So some organizations are like that. Nonprofits, they're kind of a mishmash of different things. So the federal government may one year say, this is the year of the left-handed person. And they'll give you money to design a pamphlet. And then that's it. The provincial government remains responsible for ongoingly funding that, because the provincial government in Canada is responsible for healthcare issues and certain zones, right? The federal government is responsible for crime, the military, and so on. So go back and review from your first year social work classes who's responsible for what. The municipal government is responsible for things like snow plowing and sidewalks. So here, I'm going to take that little example there and I'm going to walk it through. So let's say in the alley behind my house, there's people who do sex trade work, who vomit, sleep, trash things, spray paint things. It's quite unnerving, and it's been pernicious. I've lived in a particular place in the hood for 13 years. So if you apply to the municipal government, you phone them, you send them emails, they'll say to you, this isn't really our problem. This is a provincial government problem. The provincial government is supposed to be paying for mental health programs, addiction and healing programs. They're supposed to be paying for subsidized housing. If these people are homeless, that's part of why they're in the street creating chaos, right? Mm-hmm. When the provincial government made the move to deinstitutionalize people with severe and persistent mental health issues, they kind of, hey, we're going to let everybody who has mental health issues, we're going to let them be free. We want them to be able to make their own choices.
And give them no help to do that.
And give them no help or inadequate or poorly matched help to do that. Mm-hmm. So then you end up with the municipal government behind my house. There's 10, 20, 30 people who kind of set up house in the alley. They've started fires. They set a car on fire once. They've set fences on fire. They can be very threatening. They're very scary to the average Joe and Jane who says, hey, I pay my $2,000 a year municipal tax, and this feels municipal because it's right here in my alley. But you can see right there the pressure between the two. The provincial government is supposed to provide services and programs, right? And the municipal government is the one picking up the litter and dealing with the calls, right? And then the average citizen ends up cleaning up their own alley, or not cleaning up their own alley, or having a fire, or so on, right? So these are when you work in social work with victims of abuse, figuring out who's supposed to pay for this, who
is paying for this,
is paying for some portion of this, who might get pressured into doing more, and meanwhile, many of the times in the social work profession in Canada, disproportionately it's women who are on the payroll as employees. I don't know, sometimes it feels to me like 80% of, or 90% is all women. So, for example, in my social work classes, it's almost all women, and there might be 4 or 5 men in a group of 30, 35 students. And when you get out into women's shelters, homeless shelters, rape crisis centers, a lot of the programming and supports in the nonprofit sector, it's women employees. And it tends to be women employees being paid poorly, having few benefits, having minimal upscaling for their career, like promotion opportunities, and we'll send you to go do these courses and workshops and trainings. More often it's expected to be done on their own dime, right? So, where am I going with all this? We have our ideals of what we would like to deliver on any given day to any particular client. Then we have the gritty on the ground day-to-day practice of what we can or can't actually do. The clients we work with can't pay fee for service, often, and neither should they, right? They may not, even if they have an employee assistance program, they may choose to not go see a therapist because of this stigma and because of the worry, what if this gets back to my boss? Right? Our clients who've been sexually assaulted, let's say, they can't afford to pay for their own therapist. It's $120 an hour in this town for a psychologist, a registered psychologist. Charities often like to give the most, let's say, primal resources, like sandwiches to homeless people or socks to the elderly, or, you know. They don't like to be responsible for ongoing counseling and ongoing services in general. So who's left to pay for it? Volunteers. And so you often have stories of women volunteers doing volunteer work or almost volunteer work to care for social work with victims of abuse. It's ethically questionable and challenging. To do nothing is ethically challenging. To do something is ethically challenging. Right?
Rock in a hard place.
Right, rock in a hard place. So I wanted to just put that. Another thing I wanted to talk about today under organizations and social work with victims of abuse is many organizations oversell what they actually deliver. So they'll have their mission statements, they have their pamphlets, they have their promo once a year at Christmas, they have their year-end report. I remember working with one organization in Northern Ontario where they had wages for one person 10 hours a week. That's it. And it was almost minimum wage. But they said they did all things for all women in Northern Ontario on one of their pamphlets. Well, that seems quite improbable, actually.
Do you really plan on it?
But the funder would almost insist on that. Like, show us what you do, or we won't even give you the pittance that we gave you last year. So this is a pattern that the funder has certain things they want to achieve. They have certain ethics, maybe a Catholic ethic, like some charities have. We will not be involved with abortion counseling. We will not provide services for gay couples. Some charities...
So they may have special stipulations. Or...
Exactly, so they're constrictive, and they have their ethics. And then the federal government may wish to dump it on provincial wishes to dump it on federal. Meanwhile, it doesn't get delivered, whatever the thing is that needs to be delivered. Give you a very concrete example again. This is not so much from BC specifically, but it's an example. In certain places in the States, they've been doing the rape kits. They collect the rape kit data.
They just haven't been doing the tests?
They haven't been processing them. So I've been hearing stories of where 1,000 rape kits sit in some closet somewhere and aren't being processed. So let's say you were raped by someone. You go to the hospital, you do your rape kit, you do all these things. I actually have a video, a documentary that talks about this, and it's different women telling their story. So let's say you were sexually assaulted, you don't know who it was, the classic sort of stranger who attacks you in a parking lot. But you do the right thing. You go to the hospital, you fill in all the paperwork, you do the rape kit, which takes a lot out of a victim when they're in that traumatic space.
Because they might be subject to some questions that are uncomfortable or potential like victim blaming.
Yeah, well, even just staying there for 6 hours waiting.
And having to answer questions about the fact that you just got raped.
Yeah, and you got to go to work in the morning. Or your kids have nobody supervising them right now. Or you're putting yourself at risk. You do know who it was who raped you, but you want to prove who it was. Like, you know it was your neighbor 3 buildings over, but you want to prove it was him, so you do the rape kit. So women, victims, are putting all this energy into the rape kit, thinking, I did the right thing, it's being moved forward. A year later, I get raped, I do the rape kit. 2 years later, Steven Spielberg gets raped and does the rape kit. How rageful would we be when we realized they didn't even process our rape kits? Plus, if they had processed yours...
They would have known that he was the same person.
And they
he was
would
a serial rapist.
And they would have stopped him before he got to me.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a story where the justice system is supposed to be funding certain things. But the medical system is involved, and there's a wiggle space there, right? In different jurisdictions in the Western world, right? The other thing is sometimes if let's say a police force has a certain budget, they get to make decisions. And they may say, oh, this program or this support or having one more cop on the payroll is more important than the $87,000 it's going to cost to process those rape kits. Right? They make a choice based on their racist, classist, sexist, homophobic, traditional, perhaps, perspective compared to what we might do as social workers working with victims of abuse. We would give this a priority, right? So reflecting on the funding, that push and shove between who's going to pay which agency, which organization, which discipline, and what they declare in their pamphlets or on their once-a-year 1-minute blurb on the news, and what they actually do on the ground. I'm saying all this because it can feel very perplexing. You can be thinking, as a younger person raised on CSI and all these cop shows where they solve the problem in 60 minutes, they find the person, they use all the most modern technology.
Cops, NYPD, Forensic Files.
Yes, all those shows, and it feels like, yay!
Science.
Right, but then in real life, you may be feeling really shocked of how things play out if you're in a small northern community and you say, okay, well, we did the rape kit, but nobody processed it. Or, okay, we went to do the rape kit, but there was nobody there to do the rape kit with us. Or, we brought the client in a police car to the hospital to do the rape kit, we did the rape kit, but then the client has to figure out how to get home. There's nobody to drive her home. She lives 85 miles from here. There's no bus. Is she going to pay her own taxi? Is the hospital going to pay that taxi? Is the justice system going to pay that taxi? Does she have to hitchhike on the highway of tears having just been raped and it's 2 in the morning? Right? So I share that because that's often a challenge we have as practitioners. The ideal, the imagined ideal, and then how it actually plays out. So I want to talk a little bit about organizations now, a different kind of angle on that. Whether it's residential schools, the Catholic Church, the police forces, Harvey Weinstein. There's a whole bunch of these examples where sexual harassment, sexual abuse, racially motivated abuse, bad things have happened. It's been going on since the first 4 people were on planet Earth. And they started.
Memorial.
Yeah. So, here's what I want to draw your attention to. There is a pattern. In general, people want to get not involved. People say, I saw nothing, I know nothing. Why does that happen? That's part of the pattern because people are afraid. In the Harvey Weinstein story, if we take that, he was a famous Hollywood producer. You may have even been at some wine and cheese party with him, Steven Spielberg over there. And apparently this guy for 30 years or 20 years constantly was sexually assaulting women employees, whether they were sort of research assistants or clerks, or sexually assaulting women who wanted to be in his movies. And at one point, it looks like there's more than 80 women he sexually assaulted. And he got away with it for a very long time because everybody around him said, I didn't see anything, I don't know anything. They were afraid they'd lose their job or they'd get targeted for malice from him. And he was influential in the movie industry. He could ruin your career. People were afraid they wouldn't be believed. There's a situation, one woman was actually sexually assaulted by him. She went to the police and somehow they lost the documents or something happened that made you think, wow, Harvey Weinstein even had influence in the police department at that time. So if you get a chance to watch the documentary on that, it was on the weekend. That's part of why it's on top of my mind.
I think it's also on Netflix as well.
Netflix as well. We're going to give you a list of very interesting things you can watch. We haven't put that all together yet, but I'm sure if you Googled Harvey Weinstein, you'd find a lot of stuff. If you Google residential school, Catholic Church, or if you're watching the 6 o'clock news lately about police forces as an organization. Using the police force this last weekend, to give another example, there were, from my understanding of what has happened, 2 police officers. One pushed an elderly man down. The man fell backwards, hit his head, and a second officer walked by and was right there and did nothing. And then it seemed about 20 other police officers just kept walking. And so those 2 officers were reprimanded. I think they were even fired. Don't quote me on that part. But other police officers kind of formed a little posse and said, we're going to go on strike, we're going to resist, or our union says you can't do this. So there's a situation where you think, how is this even possible? Mm-hmm. These things can happen. The police force can sometimes, as an organization, back their own people who have done an injustice or an abuse.
They had said similar stuff about how there was history of racial abuse or like outbursts and things like that in their careers, and they were either like sloughed off or like left completely unpunished. Precisely. And then they resulted in like deaths later.
Precisely. So organizations, there tends to be a pattern. Everybody who isn't directly involved tries to get out of being involved for various reasons. I won't get promoted, I'll be blacklisted, I'll get fired. Also, I just don't want to get involved. Sometimes people just don't want to deal with conflict or stress. Sometimes they think, I'm not sure what I actually saw, right? If I'll give you an example. There was a coach in America who had been sexually abusing the boys that he was training. And at one point, a cleaning person came in at night to the sports area to clean, and he heard there was a man in a shower with a younger boy, and he heard this. So our intuition at first would be, what's that? And then if you have a mind that's paranoid like us with our training, it'd be like, oh no, somebody's having sex. But then when you realize an older man is having sex with a boy.
That's not sex anymore.
Right, that's abuse. That's sexual assault. That's abuse. That's exploitation. That's oppression. That's a whole bunch of things. But reflect on that. If this is a coach who's famous, and I'm a cleaning person, graveyard shift, do I want to go and report that? Am I absolutely certain I heard what I think I heard? Mm-hmm. What proof do I have that I heard what I heard?
Yeah. Or that if they question me on it, that I could prove anything else other than the fact that I heard something.
You heard something. Right. And we know all of these dynamics. We process that in our brain pretty quickly, and then we say, it's not my problem, we walk away. Right. Similar stories and I've seen this on the news 100 times in my lifetime. A woman is dead. Woman's dead. They find a woman beaten up. They find a woman raped. They find a woman murdered. And they'll interview neighbors. And often you'll hear the neighbors say, oh yeah, I heard a lot of yelling going on last night, but I didn't really know what to do. Or, yeah, that family's been kind of strange. You know, I've noticed some things with the kids. They always seem really shy and scared. But it wasn't really my problem. Right? So you reflect on it and you think people knew something was going on, but they didn't know who to report to, what to report. They didn't know what the boundary or appropriate space was for reporting. Do I report this to the police? Do I report this to the landlord? Is it none of my business? What if I report it and the guy who's beating his wife next door comes over and beats the shit out of me and my kids?
Or if it somehow falls back on you, if you somehow get implicated in it.
Right. Do I want to go spend a whole day sitting in court so that I can testify? Yeah. In small and northern communities, people will be especially afraid because, hey, everybody knows where everybody lives. It's pretty easy to go find me, right? So this is a pattern. People don't want to get involved, or they don't know what to say. They don't know how to deal with it. So that's a pattern. The other pattern is organizations want to wash their hands of things. They want to say, we're an organization that delivers hockey coaching, or we deliver movies, or we deliver Catholic religion. All this other stuff about sex has nothing to do with us. But we as advocates for victims of abuse would say, hey, if Harvey Weinstein had been stopped the first time he did this, 79 women or 179 women would have been saved a lot of horror and anguish. Mm-hmm. Right? The same with the Catholic Church. We know now thousands of times children were sexually abused by priests, and the Catholic Church as an organization just kept moving the priests to new geographies. One of these police officers who recently was in the news with the Black Lives Matter story had been fired or almost fired in a previous police district, I guess. And when he applied for his job in his new state, so I don't know, I'll say he was working in Florida and then he applied for a job in the Yukon or something, worked there for a year or two, then went again and moved. So the authorities sometimes don't know how to do or can't do an efficient record check on people. And many times people are cautious to put this in writing. So if I was your supervisor and you worked in a women's organization and I suspected you had done racist abuse, if there had been 2 complaints of people of color against you being abusive, right, and some stranger calls me and says, we're considering hiring Carlene, she worked for you 11 years ago, and we're wondering if you could give us a reference about her. I'm cautious on the phone to call her out as a racist abuser because I don't know who this is. Could be your mom, right? And anything I say in this world of litigiousness, people are going to say, what is your evidence for what you've just said about Carlene, right? We have to reflect on that too. To be fair, on the other side, right? If you accused me of murdering children, how do I defend myself and say I've never murdered a child in my whole life?
I have 0 children in my home.
Right, what's my proof that I'm innocent
Yeah.
of this? So we have to, in social work and professional organizations, we have to be really cautious because people theoretically could be falsely accused of being racist, classist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, whatever, right? We want to make sure that we are credible in the things we say. So there's a pattern. People don't want to get involved. The organization says we don't want to get involved. The organization says until our lawyers tell us we can speak on this issue, we don't want to speak on this issue. Oftentimes, if people step up or if the organization steps up, what they'll like to say is, it's a bad apple. There was one bad cop. There was one Catholic priest who couldn't keep his penis in his pants. There was one man, one time, who
Not all men.
Not all men, etc. Right? So people will choose to maybe pick one scapegoat and put it all on that person, rather than looking at their organization and saying, what is it about your organization that you keep drawing these people who have toxic masculinity, who are into power and control, who like to wear a uniform and push elderly people down and so on, right?
And if you're not facilitating it, how are you allowing it to continue?
Exactly. In some way, you're perhaps unintentionally colluding with an oppression as an organization. So organizations, that'll be their next thing, is they'll say bad apples. Another pattern that you'll often see is an organization will say, we fired them and we're done. So rather than really putting a lot of energy into proving that it was what the victims are saying happened,
or taking responsibility, or doing something to prevent it in future, they're just making it the cop's problem, and that it was completely
an
of his own
individual bad
volition.
apple. It was just this thing.
An isolated incident.
An isolated incident. I have a video on cleaning companies in America. And what happens is a lot of these cleaning companies are contractors. They go into these big office buildings. They go in at night. And what they often like to do is hire illegal workers, because they can pay them less and they can treat them bad. So what could happen is, in this documentary, they show how basically any man called Igor can open a cleaning company. Igor's cleaning company, cheapest in town, best cleaners. He finds himself 100 women who are oppressed and vulnerable. He pays them minimum wage to come and clean. He can then also sexually harass them and sexually abuse them because he's alone with them in a big building at night with nobody else around. So he's got, let's say, 10 offices he's cleaning.
And in a position of power.
In a position of power. And the women aren't going to complain, because who do they complain to? If they're illegals in America, they're worried, if I go and tell the police my boss is sexually harassing me or sexually assaulting me, A, I'll lose my job, B, I'll get kicked back to Mexico or wherever my country is, and C, I'll have no money, which is why I came here in the first place and did all these things. And or I might still not be believed, because it often is his word to her word in those kind of stories. Mm-hmm. So what do we want as advocates for social work with victims of abuse? One, we want to look at material changes, and we want to look at structural changes. So to give some examples of that, with the most recent one, with Black Lives Matter, we're saying we want all police officers 100% of the time to wear a body camera.
Not to be able to turn it off.
And not turn it off. That way, anybody who makes a claim, the police officer is protected and the vulnerable people are protected. If the cop says, oops, my camera wasn't working for that year or that month or that night, it's on him. It is your professional responsibility to check your camera every day to see if it's working, just like you check your gun or you check your car keys, or you have a flat in your police car. Yeah. These are things, material changes. Another material change in those cleaning company stories would be that maybe the cleaning ladies need to wear a body cam. Why not? Maybe all the offices need to have cameras in them that are kept on all the time, so they don't get sexually assaulted at work while they're doing cleaning.
Or that women need to be in like or groups of
In-
3 or whatever.
Exactly. We can almost always find a way to set up situations that don't have that problem. I worked with, that's brilliant what you just said, I worked with a young woman who had been working at a night place, like a 7-Eleven store, a confectionery store, working there by herself, graveyard shift, steady graveyard shift. She's alone. At one point, she's sexually assaulted by 2 men. 2 men come into the place, steal some money, sexually assault her, and lock her in the freezer room, the food room. And she's expected to show back up at work after about 3 days. So that's a problem right there.
Yeah.
The second thing is, why was she working alone? As you've just said, why is anybody working alone? There was also a young man who, here in BC, who was a gas station person, and someone was supposed to give was supposed to pay for the gas, but took off, and he tried to stop the car or something like that, and he ended up dead. Right?
He got dragged.
So the question became, why is he working alone? Again, so by enhancing it for a particularly victimized group, you can enhance the workplace for everybody. Everybody wears body camera, there's cameras everywhere. We don't leave women alone to clean, or men alone to clean, right? Like, or anything.
Just nobody by themselves.
Right, always in pairs. And if your company can't afford that,
Then something else to keep them accountable.
then maybe you don't. That service has to be the price raised. Maybe it's worth more. Similar to what we're seeing right now in elderly homes, we're starting to say, "Hey, how come we were paying everybody such crappy wages, and how come there were so few people there?" And now 70 or 80% of the people, the thousands of people who died from C-19, were in these elder homes, and we're saying, "Okay, what can we structurally do?" One, we need to have more staff. 2, appropriately trained staff. 3, well-paid staff. And we need to have them have protective gear and so on, right? So those are all material changes. And then the structure would be the provincial government and the federal government says, you will have these or we will shut you down, right? Mm-hmm. You will have, for every 10 residents, you'll have 2 personal care aides. They will give 3 baths per week to each person. A person will get 3 meals a day. All of these minimums, and if you don't, we will shut you down or we will fine you $1 bazillion. Right now, there's a sort of a class action suit for the families of the people who've died of C-19 against some of these corporations that were running such shabby places. Weirdly, in context, I was so excited to hear that. I was like, yes, that speaks to those kind of profit mongers that, bam, oh, we're going to have to pay $1 bazillion in legal fees and funds to the families who lost their loved one. That speaks to them, right? That will make them pay attention. There were attempts at one time to make the police more accountable when women, let's say that story of the rape where all 3 of us did our rape kit, you did the first one, and if they had processed the kit and caught the person before he got to rape me, mm-hmm. I would have remained safe. So a case could be made legally to say I should be able to sue the police to say because of your neglect and your abandonment and your choices, I was assaulted.
Yeah.
It makes sense. But my understanding is that in Canada, when that's been attempted, it hasn't so far been very successful.
Actually, related to that, there was a documentary on Netflix called The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez. Okay. And it was about how with social workers, you're supposed to document abuse, and documenting abuse means going to the hospital to prove those physical injuries. And there was systematic neglect and inexperienced social workers who didn't get it documented, and because of that, he ended up dying and he was 8 years old.
And so the family was trying to sue the social work department to say because of you this child died, or?
They were trying to, they were trying to include them, but they actually didn't end up suing them because they knew they wouldn't win.
Mm-hmm. See, that would be the structural changes we want to make. So we want to educate everybody, raise everybody's consciousness, but some organizational policies, procedures, laws, resources, minimum standards, make that the norm. And then everybody's a little bit better off versus the one bad apple story. Or it never happened, you're imagining it. So those are the patterns. The other thing is that I wanted to talk about under organizations, all those funding and resource questions, patterns with big organizations like residential schools or corporate cleaning companies or elder care or Harvey Weinstein, is even when we win, we lose. So if I could give you an example, I often talk about my own story, not because I need everybody to coddle me, but because it's a story I lived, so I can speak most potently, I believe, about it. So I was sexually abused by my father from my earliest memories till I was in my mid-teens, and I escaped. Then I had minimal contact for years and years and years and years. Then I found out that there might be another girl who was taking him to court who had been abused way back then. Other girls who are now women came forward, and we all went to the police and we told our story and so on. It took 5 years from the day I reported to the time he went to jail. 5 years. So there's a structural thing that is a pattern. The delay and deny. Delay, deny, diffuse. Delay, deny, diffuse. So the police, my father, everybody involved at an organizational level, the 2 lawyers and so on, just kept delaying. 5 years is a long time to hold your breath about something like that.
Yeah.
This was in another province, and I had legally changed my names, and I built a whole new life and everything. When they kept phoning me and saying, oh, it's been delayed again, or your father now claims he has Alzheimer's, or he now claims he didn't mean to confess, he wants to retract that. He's fired his lawyer 3 times. All these ways to delay and deny and diffuse, that's another pattern. The Catholic Church is hoping to delay, deny, diffuse until everybody's dead. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm almost 60 years old.
Or you run out of resources.
Or you run out of resources, or you just give up, right? And that's a pattern with the residential schools, the Catholic Church, some of those big historic organizational dynamics, diffuse, deny, delay. But even when you win, what does that mean? So my father did go to jail. He's in there for 5 years. When he comes out, he is going to be labeled a sexual predator, and he's not allowed to have guns for 10 years, right? How did that help me?
Yeah.
Like, it helps me, and it helps the other victims, but hey, I didn't even get a free meal. You know, like, it would have been nice if somebody says, oh, and for doing the right thing as a citizen, here's $1,000 so you could have a spa weekend or something, right?
Yeah.
I understand that we're worried that people will come forward because they want a spa weekend and they might make up a story, right? But my point is, oftentimes the victims, they may lose their job, they may be stigmatized in the community, they may lose relationships, they may lose time at school, they may lose all kinds of things in addition to losing sleep, losing their sense of self, losing their safety. And there's still, when you win, you don't win.
Yeah.
You don't win.
I mean, look at Brock Turner. Literally accused and only served 3 months.
Only served 3 months. But that's the perpetrator. But I mean, the victim of that, what happens to her?
Exactly. I can't imagine how she would feel.
Right? So I was told, had I kept all my receipts for all my therapy episodes and weekends of healing and all that, from the last 30 years, had I kept my receipts, I could have submitted them, and had I been able to prove that my injuries were what I focused on in the therapy sessions, again, how could I prove that? Then I might have got my money back for the therapy sessions, which is so ridiculous. I'm just, I can't even speak to it. But again, people think, oh, you'll take him to court and you'll get $1 million, or through the Victim Witness Assistance Program, you'll get something. No, in general, you don't. You don't get anything. And even the 7 hours it might take to fill in the stupid form is another waste of your time. All the hours that sometimes victims sit outside of court, let's say a wife assault victim who's been abused for years, she may, have to have had babysitters. She may have had to have therapy. She may have had to multiple times move to get away from her husband. And maybe he broke the door at 3 different apartments. Even those kinds of things. I worked with a woman who had been criminally harassed for 10 years. And she had moved many, many, many times. She kept quitting her job every time he'd find her. She had to have these like $2,000 security systems in her apartment. None of that was ever reimbursed to her. My point being, even when we win, we don't win.
Yeah.
It's
You're
not
so
like
responsible
Hollywood.
for being the precautious one. Like, you need to prevent it from happening
Right,
again.
exactly. She, this particular woman I'm referring to, she even got herself a German Shepherd trained special dog and took special training with the dog and had the dog with her 24/7 wherever she went, which again had impact for her work opportunities because not every job will let you take a dog with you, right? So even that kind of stuff, at first you don't think of it, right? That well, how has she lost money from this story, or how has she been disadvantaged? Well, we know the obvious. If he beat her up, if he broke her arm and she needed to be in a cast, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, she lost money. But even to reclaim that kind of money is a very, very big, very arduous project. And I'll tell you, in my 30 plus years of doing this kind of work, I've never once heard of anybody actually getting money. Maybe they did and they kept it a secret from me, or maybe they did, years later. But I've never heard of anybody actually getting $50 of taxi money reimbursed or anything like that, right? It probably has happened, but
Not here.
not
we
here.
know of.
Not that we know. So that idea that Hollywood often puts out of, oh, she made that all up so she could get $1 million. In my experience, that never happens. Although it theoretically could happen. So these are all the patterns. The injuries are not easily diagnosable. They're kind of vague and diffuse. Let's say if you were assaulted by someone for 2 years, let's say a boyfriend was assaulted you and was abusive and stalked you. As a result of that, you developed an eating disorder, and then you had anorexia and health issues for another 2 years until you landed on your feet. It's almost impossible to prove that the anorexia is a direct result of the abuse from that guy. Right? So this is, I just really want to disabuse you off all that, because that's often what the perpetrators will say. She made this all up so she could get my car. She made this all up so she could make $1 million off me.
Something to make it your word against theirs and cast doubt.
That's right, to make you seem uncredible. So those are some of the patterns I wanted you to reflect upon. And then just one more kind of comment under all of that around who'll step forward and so on. A lot of people are sincerely innocent of all of these issues. So if you say, oh, my ex-boyfriend, I want to get away from him, he keeps showing up at work with roses, or he keeps putting lovely little love notes on my car, or he always is in the mall when I'm in the mall, i.e. it gives me a feeling he's following me. A lot of people go, that just means he loves you. He loves you very much.
Yeah, that's so sweet. I wish my boyfriend did that.
Right. So there are people, too, who are very ignorant and innocent of racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, ageism, and so on. They just don't get it. They just sincerely don't get it. So when you go to them and say, well, I want you to step up and come to court on my behalf about the abuse, they might say, well, all I know is that he bought you roses and he often told me he loved you. Right? And they may mean that. They might believe that, right? Or we hear stories of some girl who's 14 or 15. She is dating a guy who's 25, 30.
36.
She ends up pregnant from him, and some people will innocently think, well, they should get married now. Which, for many people who work with victims of abuse issues. That is not necessarily our best solution when we have a story of an older man sexually exploiting and abusing a young girl and now she's pregnant. For him to marry her and do the right thing is kind of putting her in a worse situation. It might be putting her that she now feels, damn, I'm trapped with this guy forever. My parents forced me to marry him, or, right? Mm-hmm. This is not a solution, but the parents, the neighbors, the grandma, they may still have these old, sour, curdled, unhelpful, non-feminist solutions to a problem. Mm-hmm. Right? So, just wanted to say all that. And I wanted to also say the organization will never love you. The organization will never love you. So, write that down somewhere. We'll have in our minds sometimes, if we're innocent and optimistic, oh, I'll help this victim, we'll go to the police, and the police will do the right thing. My boss will be so excited that I've opened up 10,000 cans of worms. Not necessarily. Many times you'll get labeled as the troublemaker or the problem instead of the rapist who's the problem, or the abuser who's the problem, or let's say the coach who's sexually abusing boys. If you were, let's say, another teacher at that university and you kept hearing rumors that this coach is abusing boys, so you went to the provost or the dean or human resources and said, I have this creepy feeling that this coach is sexually abusing kids. I've had 2 kids come and tell me stories. And if the kids haven't given you permission to disclose their name and specifics, then you're just gossiping. You can become the person with the problem, where people may say, well, if you're not happy working here, we'll help you to find a job somewhere else. Or, you're free to leave at any time. Or maybe you're just an angry feminist, and that's why you're going after Joe, the hockey coach. You need help. It's very easy for things to be thrown back on you. We've certainly heard those stories in the last couple of weeks with black women activists and social justice stars, right? They're telling stories of when they call the police or when they complain about something going on in their neighborhood, they're seen as the problem. The messenger with the bad news gets labeled as the bad sound, rather than, hey, here's a person wishing to make the world better and really, really be helpful, right? So, another thing I could tell you is sometimes what happens is in organizations, things change all the time. So you have a new boss, a new program coordinator, a new facilitator, a new person in human resources. But you might be the person who's been there longitudinally. You've seen the long story. Each person that you're complaining to might say to you, hey, I've only been here a year. I'm not really feeling brave enough yet to take down the coach. I'm not really feeling brave enough or rooted enough. I've heard what you said. Thank you for sharing that with me. And I'll get back to you on that. I've only been here 5 months. Sometimes these organizations, that's part of why the predators like those organizations, is because people are always coming and going and there's always chaos. And in the midst of the chaos, they can do their predatory bad work.
So like a smoke screen.
A smoke screen. So reflect on that. Those are just some patterns, some dynamics. In your required reading, you'll see some examples of that kind of stuff. And so the organization will never love you. In small communities, organizations can be afraid. If there's only, let's say, one, we talked about that in a previous session, if there's only one cop, one priest, one social worker, and you're the one who's the social worker, and you go to the cop and the priest to complain about abuse of victims, and the priest might have one of his best friends who abused, or he might be an abuser himself, or the cop might be beating his own wife.
Mm-hmm.
So
or they could be friends with the abuser, or
exactly, or they just don't want to hear it. They just don't want to deal with it. So that can be really, really a challenge in a small northern context. Who do you go to for allies? How do you build trust? How do you build your evidence before you sort of blow something out of the water? There's a movie called Doubt, if you want to watch that, and it's about a priest and a nun and an abuse story, potentially. My take on watching it is we're never absolutely 100% sure if the priest is being abusive or not. The nun who wants to report him is never 100% sure of what happened or didn't happen. And I feel that's a kind of an example of how these stories can play out. And let's remember, all at the same time, if you're a social worker in a small community, you might already have 119 clients, way more than you can manage to deal with. So being the one person who's going to pull this 10,000 worm can of trouble into the center of the community, that's a big burden to put on you.
Yeah, and there's only so many women you can do that for.
Right.
At a given time.
You can only take so many risks before you're overwhelmed, before you're exhausted, before you're crushed, before you get fired, before somebody takes out their wrath on your other clients.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of things to reflect on. These stories are not simple. They're about nuance, discernment, pacing. They're about really observing a situation, keeping your notes. There's lots of parts to it, and ever-changing parts. So, this is our video. Thank you, Steven Spielberg. Thank you, Carlene. This is our video on organizations will never love you and what abuse might look like in an organizational backdrop for the one-on-one you might be doing with your client.